It's said that in Red Hollow, Cade Mercer could have any woman he wanted, wealthy widows, powerful young ladies, all lined up waiting. Yet the most powerful man in the prairie chose a poor girl, living quietly on the edge of town, who never once looked up at him with pleading eyes. What made him bet everything? His reputation, his fortune, his empire. On a gamble the whole town considered insane? Like, comment and tell me where you're viewing this so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because the answer will change the way you see the value of a human being. The road into Red Hollow was the kind that discouraged company. It ran through a long stretch of cracked alkali, flat before climbing a shallow ridge where the wind came off the mountain sideways and smelled of iron and dry grass. The town itself sat in a hollow between two ridgelines, which is how it got its name. And in the summer, the heat pooled there like water in a bowl. In the fall, the cold came early and stayed late. The people who lived in Red Hollow were the kind who had either chosen hard country or been broken down by it somewhere easier and ended up here by default. Most fell into the second category, though few admitted it. Cade Mercer had come to Red Hollow 22 years ago with a remuda of 9 horses, a wagon with a cracked axle, and enough cash to buy 40 acres of the least wanted land in the valley. He was 19 years old. He slept in the wagon the first winter because he hadn't had money left for lumber after buying the cattle he needed, and that winter, 2 of the 5 head he'd managed to acquire died in a freeze that dropped temperatures to 18 below for 11 consecutive days. He ate salt pork and dried beans and told himself the cold was teaching him something. By spring, he wasn't sure what the lesson had been, but he was still alive and still on the land, and that counted for something. By the time he was 41, the 40 acres had become 4,300. The 9 horses had become a working remuda of 60. The 5 cattle had become a herd that the county assessor valued at a number Cade didn't like to say out loud because it made men look at him differently, and he'd spent enough years being looked at differently. First as the foolish kid who bought the alkali ground, then as the upstart who was moving too fast, then as the man everyone wanted something from. That he'd learned to guard information about himself the way other men guarded water rights. Water rights. That was the thing that mattered in Red Hollow Valley. Everything else, cattle, reputation, marriage prospects, political influence, was secondary. Water was primary. Water determined who survived a bad year and who didn't, who could expand and who contracted, who had leverage in a dispute and who had to absorb the loss and move on. Cade controlled the largest private reservoir in the valley, a deep impoundment he'd built 7 years ago by diverting a seasonal creek and shoring up a natural depression in the rock with a clay and stone dam his crew had spent 8 months constructing. In a dry year, which in Red Hollow Valley meant most years, that reservoir was the difference between a rancher's survival and ruin. People wanted things from Cade Mercer. They had always wanted things from him, even before he had anything worth wanting, but now that he had the reservoir and the land and the herd and the money, the wanting had become almost aggressive in its persistence. He understood it. He didn't fault people for needing things. But he had also learned, through a series of hard lessons that he preferred not to think about too carefully, that want had a way of disguising itself as affection, and that distinguishing between the two was a skill most people either never developed or never needed to develop because they'd never had enough to make it matter. He'd tried once. Her name had been Marguerite Sills, daughter of a cattle buyer from up north, and she'd come to Red Hollow in the spring of 1882 with her father on business. She was quick-witted and laughed at things Cade actually found funny, rather than at the polite moments when laughter was expected. And she'd seemed genuinely uninterested in his holdings, which at the time were substantial but not yet enormous. They'd spent 3 weeks in each other's company with a frequency that caused talk, and Cade had allowed himself to believe that he'd found something real. He found out later, through a chain of secondhand information that was humiliating in its indirectness, that Marguerite's father had positioned the whole thing deliberately, that Marguerite had known exactly what she was doing, and that the marriage her father had been engineering would have given him favorable water access through a disputed easement that Cade controlled. Whether Marguerite herself had been a willing participant in the scheme or simply a compliant daughter who didn't ask too many questions, he never determined. He stopped caring about the distinction after a while. The result was the same. After that, he was careful. He was polite to the widows who found reasons to visit his ranch with plates of food and suggestions about their loneliness. He was cordial to the fathers who steered their daughters toward him at the quarterly dances held in the back of Fenwick's Mercantile. He was patient with the town council members who worked marriage alliances into conversations about grazing rights and road maintenance. He did not encourage any of it. He did not close doors on it either, because closing doors caused resentment, and resentment caused trouble, and he had enough trouble without manufacturing more. What he did was wait people out. He'd found that if he was pleasant enough and non-committal enough and busy enough, most people eventually redirected their efforts toward more responsive targets. There were always other ranchers in Red Hollow Valley, not as wealthy, not as well-positioned, but more available, more interested in the transaction that marriage in frontier country inevitably was. He waited them out, and he ran his ranch, and he got up before dawn every morning, regardless of weather, and he went to bed when the work was done, which was usually well past dark. He had two full-time hands, a weathered man named Ott Briscoe, who had been with him for 14 years and knew the cattle better than Cade did, and a younger man named Rollo Fitch, who was clumsy with a rope but reliable about showing up and doing what he was told. In the busy seasons, he hired on extra labor from town, men who needed work and could follow direction. The ranch ran as well as anything in the valley. He had built a good life by any reasonable measure. He told himself that regularly, and most of the time he believed it. But Lena Ashford had not grown up in Red Hollow. She'd come from a settlement 2 days east, a place even smaller and more precarious than Red Hollow, with her grandfather Elias when she was 14 years old after the rest of her family. Her parents, her younger brother, had been taken by a fever outbreak that emptied half the settlement in the space of 3 weeks. Elias Ashford was her mother's father, a former surveyor who had come west in his 40s with a modest homestead claim and the intention of spending his final years somewhere that didn't remind him of everything he'd lost back east. He was a quiet man with large, careful hands and a habit of measuring things, distances, angles, the width of a creek at various points along its length, that had never entirely left him even after he stopped doing it professionally. He measured furniture before he moved it. He measured rainfall in a tin can he kept on the fence post. He measured Lena's height against the doorframe of the cabin every year on her birthday, and noted the result in a small ledger he kept for the purpose. The homestead was 80 acres on the eastern margin of Red Hollow Valley, where the floor of the valley rose toward a broken escarpment, and the soil was a mix of rocky clay and sandy loam that wasn't ideal for anything, but wasn't entirely hopeless either. Elias had run a small garden, a milk cow, 6 pigs, and a flock of chickens whose numbers fluctuated according to the predator pressure in any given season. He grew enough to eat and sold small surpluses in town when he had them. It was a subsistence operation, and had always been. But Elias was not a man who measured his success by his surplus. Lena had arrived at 14 and immediately become necessary. She could see that within the first week. Elias was 63, and his hands were beginning to trouble him, a stiffening of the joints that made fine work painful and heavy work exhausting. He didn't complain about it. He adjusted his methods. But the adjustment had limits, and Lena arrived at the edge of those limits and simply occupied the space that needed occupying. She learned to tend the garden by watching Elias and asking specific questions when she was uncertain. She learned to slaughter and dress a pig, which she had not enjoyed but had done without excessive distress once she understood that squeamishness was a luxury the homestead couldn't afford. She learned which neighbors were worth trading with and which would shortchange you if you weren't paying attention. She learned to drive a wagon well enough that she could make the 4-mile trip into Red Hollow and back without incident, which Elias increasingly relied on her for as his joints worsened. She was not what people in Red Hollow initially thought of as remarkable. She was medium height, with brown hair that she kept pinned back practically rather than fashionably, and a face that was more honest than pretty, though it was not unpleasant to look at. She dressed for utility. She spoke when she had something to say, and was quiet when she didn't, which in a frontier town where conversation was both entertainment and social currency meant she was sometimes perceived as standoffish by people who didn't know her well and simply reserved by people who did. She had a small reputation as someone you could rely on. If she said she'd be somewhere, she was there. If she said she'd done something, it was done. In a place where reputation was built from small consistencies, this counted for more than it might have seemed. She'd been in Red Hollow for 4 years when Elias fell. He was up on the roof of the small outbuilding they used for storing feed, patching a section that had developed a leak after a hailstorm the previous week. Lena had offered to do it herself, had in fact argued that she should be the one to do it because she was more agile and he shouldn't be on a roof with his hands the way they were. Elias had listened to the argument, acknowledged its merits, and climbed the ladder anyway. He was not a man who yielded easily to the logic of his own limitations. He fell when a section of old roofing gave way under his weight. He fell 8 feet and landed badly, his left leg taking the impact at an angle that broke the tibia in 2 places. The break was not clean. Lena set it as best she could with what she had, which was not much. She'd read what she could find about setting bones and had splinted animals before, which was not the same thing but was better than nothing, and then drove him to town to see Doc Hartley, who confirmed that she'd done as well as anyone could have done with the materials available, and informed her that the leg would heal but that Elias would be off his feet for a minimum of 6 weeks and would likely carry some impairment permanently. He did carry the impairment. The leg healed crooked, not dramatically, but enough that he walked with a pronounced hitch and tired more quickly than before. He could do light work. Heavy work, hauling, chopping, long periods on his feet, was beyond him now in a way it hadn't been before the fall. This was their situation as the summer of 1884 began to wind toward fall, and it was the situation that was quietly framing every decision Lena was making about how they were going to survive the coming winter. The garden had been fair, not exceptional. It had been a dry summer, and she'd had to water by hand more than she'd wanted to, carrying water from the small tank behind the cabin, but fair enough that she'd put up reasonable stores of preserved vegetables. The chickens were producing. One of the pigs had been slaughtered in August, and the meat was salted and hanging. She had 1.5 cords of firewood cut and stacked, which wasn't enough for a hard winter, but was a start. What she did not have was the cash to replace the fence posts along the south end of the property that had been deteriorating for 2 seasons, which meant the south boundary was vulnerable in a way that made her nervous. She did not have the labor to fix everything that needed fixing with Elias unable to do heavy work. And she did not have a clear plan for what happened if this winter was a bad one. She had not asked anyone for help. It had occurred to her to ask, as it would occur to any reasonable person in her situation. She'd thought about what it would mean to approach some of the more established ranchers in the valley, not Mercer specifically, she hadn't been thinking about him in particular, and explain her situation and see what kind of arrangement might be made. She'd turned the idea over several times and put it down each time for a reason she had difficulty articulating precisely. It wasn't pride exactly, or not only pride. It was more that she had seen how those arrangements worked, the invisible debts they created, the way the person who had given help retained a kind of claim on the person who'd received it that nobody acknowledged directly, but everybody understood. She was 18 years old, and she was not in a position to be beholden to anyone in the way that asking for help would make her beholden. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if she could manage it. So she didn't ask. She worked with what she had, made plans for the shortfalls, and waited to see what the fall brought. Cade saw her for the first time in a way that actually registered in September, at the weekly market that the town held in the open lot behind the livery on Saturday mornings. He'd seen her before, obviously. Red Hollow was not large enough for any 2 people who spent time there to remain entirely invisible to each other, but he'd seen her the way you see most people in a small town, as a category rather than an individual. Elias Ashford's granddaughter, the girl who ran the Ashford homestead now that the old man was laid up. Quiet, kept to herself. What he saw that Saturday morning was something different. She was at the far end of the market row, examining a pile of fence posts that Vic Dunmore had brought in on a wagon for sale. Dunmore's posts were cedar, straight, and well cut, which made them valuable, and they'd drawn several buyers that morning. When Cade walked past, Lena was in conversation with Dunmore. Though conversation was probably not the right word for it, it was more like a negotiation in which one party knew exactly what the other wanted and was using that knowledge deliberately. 2 bits each, Dunmore was saying. That's the going rate for cedar posts. You know that as well as I do. The going rate in April, Lena said. She was holding one of the posts, turning it in her hands, checking the grain. It's September. Anybody who needed posts in spring already bought them. You've been sitting on this load. So So you've got carrying costs. And you've got another month until hard freeze, which means if you don't sell before then, you're reloading in December, or you're leaving them out and hoping the ends don't check over winter. Dunmore looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite annoyance and wasn't quite respect. I can sell these any time I want. You can try to, Lena said. She set the post down. I'll give you 20 cents each for 30 posts, paid today. Cash. She paused. That's $6 for something you've been hauling around for 2 months. Dunmore was quiet for a moment. Then, 22 cents. 21, Lena said. Deal, Dunmore said, and they shook on it, and Lena went to the small purse she kept in her coat pocket and counted out the coins with the care of someone for whom the amount was not trivial. Cade stood there longer than he'd intended, watching her arrange for the post to be delivered to her property. She didn't look up. She wasn't performing for anyone. She had come to market with a specific purpose, done the thing she'd come to do, and when the arrangement was concluded, she moved on to the next item on her list without apparent satisfaction or celebration. He didn't approach her. He wasn't sure why he kept thinking about it for the rest of that day. He thought about it again 2 weeks later when old Harlan Stokes mentioned the Ashford place in the context of a conversation about the valley's water situation. They were at Fenwick's, Cade and Harlan and 2 other ranchers, Pete Colquitt and a man named Gus Waverly, who had land on the north end of the valley, sitting at the rough table in the back of the store where the town's informal business got done. The stove was going because the evenings had turned cold, and Fenwick had put out a pot of coffee that nobody was paying for, but everybody was drinking. The problem, Harlan was saying. Harlan was always identifying the problem. It was his primary contribution to any group discussion. Is that if we have a dry winter like the last 2, there won't be enough snowpack to refill the creek before April. Some of the smaller operations are already thin. Define thin, Pete said. The Ashford place, for one, Harlan said. That old man can barely walk anymore. The girl's been running it herself. Their tank's near empty and they've got no good access to the creek from that property. Cade knew this. He'd been aware of it in a general way. The Ashford property's eastern location put it at the margin of the valley's water distribution, and the natural grade ran against them. Water flowed west and south, not east, which meant the Ashford land was dependent on their own small tank, and whatever precipitation fell directly on the property. What are they going to do? Gus asked. Harlan shrugged. What can they do? Girl's probably looking for someone to buy them out. She hasn't made any approaches, Cade said. He'd heard nothing about it. Not yet, Harlan said. There was a quality to the way Harlan said it that Cade recognized. It was the tone of someone who expected an opening to materialize and was positioning to walk through it when it did. Harlan Stokes was not a malicious man, but he was acquisitive, and the Ashford land, while not prime, had features that would be useful additions to the Stokes holdings. He had his own water situation to manage. Cade drank his coffee and said nothing further, which was his usual approach to information he was still thinking about. He rode out to the Ashford property on a Thursday morning at the beginning of October, which was later in the season than he'd intended when he first thought about going. He'd been occupied with the fall gather and then with a dispute about a shared fence line with Gus Waverly that had required more time than it should have. He rode out not entirely certain what he was going to say, which was unusual for him. He generally preferred to know what he was going to say before he said it. The property announced itself as land that had been worked hard without quite enough resources. The garden was in, but the beds hadn't been fully turned for winter yet. The outbuilding had a section of roof that looked newly repaired, but the rest of it showed its age. The fence line on the south side had gaps where posts were missing or listing at angles that would stop stopping cattle effectively. The cabin itself was small but well maintained. Someone had whitewashed it recently. The girl, Lena, was in the yard splitting firewood when he rode up. She was wearing a canvas jacket that was too large for her and had her sleeves rolled to the forearm despite the cold. She stopped splitting when she heard his horse and turned, and there was a moment where he could see her taking in the information of who he was and what it might mean before she settled on an expression that was neutral and watchful. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not surprised exactly. More like someone who had registered an unexpected development and was choosing not to show that she was registering it. "Miss Ashford," he said. He dismounted because it was rude to conduct a conversation from horseback with someone who was on foot, and tied his horse to the fence post near the gate. I was passing this way. I wanted to see how things were sitting with you going into winter. We're managing, she said. I heard your water situation's short. It's not good, she said, but we'll work it. He looked at the woodpile. It was not enough for a bad winter. He looked at the fence line to the south. It needed work. He'd been told the tank was low, and from where he stood he could see it. Low was a charitable description. I can extend a water access easement through my south pasture, he said. It'd give you a pipe run to my reservoir. Short haul on your end. She was quiet for a moment. He'd expected some version of relief, or interest, or the beginning of the negotiation that would follow an opening like that. What he got was a stillness that he couldn't read. What are you asking for that? She said finally. Nothing, he said. She looked at him. People don't offer water rights for nothing in this valley. I know they don't, he said. Then why are you? It was a fair question, and he didn't have a clean answer ready. He'd been turning over that question himself during the ride out. He said, because your place doesn't need to fail, and because I've got the water to spare, which most people in the valley know, and nobody's done anything about it. That's not an answer, she said. That's a description of a situation. He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed, which was a habit he'd developed over years of conversations where smiling at the wrong moment read as condescension. I'm not looking for anything from you, if that's what you're asking. It's what I'm asking, she said. Then the answer is, I'm not looking for anything. I'm offering a water easement because it makes practical sense and it costs me nothing that matters. She was quiet again, looking at him with the careful attention of someone who was checking the math of what they'd just been told and finding parts of it that didn't resolve cleanly. I'll need to think about it, she said. He nodded. Fair enough. He untied his horse. I'll leave the offer standing. He rode back without the conversation he'd been half expecting, which would have been some version of negotiation and perhaps gratitude and the beginning of whatever social obligation a gift of that magnitude would create. He hadn't gotten that. He'd gotten a woman who said she needed to think about it, which was not, he reflected, what most people said when you offered them water in a dry year. He found it interesting. She came to his ranch 6 days later on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a brown mare that had seen better years but moved well enough. He was in the equipment barn with Ott, working on a wagon wheel that had developed a wobble serious enough to address before the ground froze, and he heard hoofbeats in the yard and came out to see who it was. She dismounted without fuss and tied her horse to the rail near the barn door and walked toward him with the purposeful movement of someone who had decided something and come to execute the decision. I'll take the easement, she said. But I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to. All right, he said. I'm agreeing to a water access agreement, nothing else. It doesn't obligate me to anything social or political or economic beyond the terms of the access itself. If you ever need the easement dissolved, you tell me with reasonable notice and I find another arrangement. Same if I need to terminate it. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I think about everything that involves my property, she said. Can you live with those terms? Yes, he said. Then we should put it in writing, she said. I don't do handshake agreements on things that matter. Neither do I, he said. I'll have the paper drawn up this week. She nodded once, which seemed to be her version of satisfaction with the conversation, and then she said, Your wheel's tracking off the left side. Looks like the hub's worn. He turned and looked at the barn. From where she was standing, she could see the wagon inside the barn at the angle where the problem was visible. He hadn't realized that. Hub's fine, he said. It's the spoke tension. She said, in a way that wasn't agreement and wasn't argument. You want to look at it? He said, because something in him was curious about whether she'd actually spotted something he'd missed. They went into the barn and she crouched next to the wheel and ran her hand around the hub, checking the fit. And then she said, It's both, actually. Spoke tension pulled the hub out of true. Fix the spokes, and you'll still have hub wear. She stood up and looked at him. But you probably know that. I do now, he said. Ott was watching from the far end of the barn with an expression of careful blankness that Cade recognized as Ott's way of being extremely entertained without acknowledging that he was entertained. I'll need your grandfather's signature on the easement agreement as well as yours, Cade said, if he's the deed holder. He is, she said. You can come to the property to get his signature, or I can bring him to town. Easier for you to come, probably. The ride's hard on his leg. I'll come, Cade said. She left shortly after that, and Ott waited approximately 10 seconds before saying, Well, get the wheel finished, Cade said. Yes, sir, Ott said, and said nothing else, which was another thing Cade appreciated about Ott. The paper was drawn up by the end of the week, and Cade rode out to the Ashford place on a Saturday morning to get signatures. He met Elias Ashford for the first time, a man in his late 60s with a surveyor's precise handshake and eyes that had catalogued Cade within about 4 seconds of the introduction. His leg was visibly worse than Lena had let on, not in crisis, but bad enough. He walked with a cane now, and the cane was clearly necessary. They sat at the kitchen table, and Cade laid out the document, and Elias read every word of it, which took a while because the old man read carefully and paused several times to ask questions that were precise and practical. He'd asked about the seasonal variability of Cade's reservoir levels, which was a reasonable concern. An easement tied to a water source that fluctuated dramatically in a bad year wasn't worth much. Cade answered honestly. The reservoir had never dropped below usable levels since he'd built it, but he couldn't guarantee that in an extreme year. That's honest, Elias said, and signed. Lena signed after him with a careful, clear signature that looked like someone who had been taught penmanship seriously and hadn't abandoned it. Cade took his copy of the document and stood to leave, and Lena walked him to the door. In the yard, before he mounted, she said, "Why did you really come out here?" It wasn't a question exactly. It had the shape of a question, but the weight of an observation. "I told you," he said. "You told me a reason," she said. "I'm asking why." He thought about it. He could have given her a version of the answer that was diplomatic and covered the ground without exposing anything. He'd given that version of answers many times. "Because you were the only person at that market who was transacting on her own behalf," he said. "Not to impress someone. Not to maneuver into something. You were buying fence posts because you needed fence posts." He paused. "It's less common than it sounds." She considered that for a moment. "That's a strange reason to offer someone water rights." "Probably," he said. He mounted up. "Let me know if there are problems with the pipe connection on your end. Ott can help run the line." He rode out before she could say anything else to that, which was, he was aware, something of a tactical retreat. He wasn't entirely sure what he was retreating from, but it felt prudent. The pipeline was run the following week, with Ott doing most of the technical work and Rollo helping with the trenching. Lena worked alongside them without being asked, handling the trench work on her own property end with a shovel and a steadiness that made the job go faster than it would have otherwise. She didn't talk much during the work, but she answered questions directly when Ott had them and took direction without defensiveness when the line required adjustments. When it was done and the water was flowing, she stood and watched it run into her tank for a moment, and then she looked at Ott and said, "Thank you, both of you." "Yes, ma'am," Ott said. She didn't look at Cade when she said it. She was addressing the people who had done the actual physical work, which Ott later told Cade, in his understated way, that he'd found appropriate. Word got around Red Hollow within the week, as all things got around Red Hollow eventually. The framing of it varied depending on who was doing the framing. Some people said Cade had finally made a practical decision about consolidating water access in the Eastern Valley. Some people said it was charity that he was too proud to call charity. And some people, the widows and their intermediaries and the families with daughters and the ranchers who'd hoped for a different kind of alliance, said things that were less generous. Mabel Thorpe, who was one of the more energetic managers of other people's business in Red Hollow, said it to her sister-in-law within earshot of enough people that it effectively became public. "Cade Mercer's gone soft. Either that or the Ashford girl's cleverer than she looks." Cade heard about it secondhand and didn't respond to it, which was what he generally did with Mabel Thorpe's opinions. But Lena heard about it too, and she heard about it differently. The Ashford girl's cleverer than she looks contained an implication that she'd maneuvered Cade into something, which put her in the same category of people he'd been guarding himself against for years. And she found that implication personally offensive in a way that the comment about Cade going soft was not. She showed up at his ranch on a Thursday evening, which was unusual. He didn't get unannounced visitors in the evening generally. And when he came out to the porch, she was standing in the yard with the look of someone who had something to say and had decided to come say it rather than let it sit. "I need you to know," she said, without preliminary, "that I didn't maneuver anything. The easement is a business arrangement, and I want it to stay a business arrangement, and I want it to be clear that I'm not—" She stopped, reorganized. "I'm not what they're saying I am." He looked at her for a moment. "I know that," he said. "I don't want your charity, and I'm not running a scheme." "I know that too." She seemed unsatisfied with the simplicity of his answers. "How?" "Because you negotiated the terms of the easement like someone who expected to be accountable to them," he said, "not like someone who was getting something for nothing." She stood there a moment longer, and he thought she was going to say something else, but she didn't. She turned and walked back to her horse and mounted and rode out. And Cade stood on his porch and watched her go and thought, that was someone who'd just been insulted in a way she couldn't prove and couldn't directly confront. And she'd come here to at least assert the truth of the thing to the one person who had standing to know it. He thought about that for a while after she'd gone. October hardened into November, and the things that Harlan Stokes had predicted about the water situation proved accurate. The snowpack in the mountains was thin. The creek that fed the valley's smaller tanks ran lower than it should have by mid-November, and ranchers who'd been managing began making harder decisions about their herds. The valley's established powers, Harlan Stokes, Pete Colquitt, a man named Voss who had the largest commercial cattle operation in the county and had been buying influence in Red Hollow for a decade, began making more pointed suggestions to Cade about how the water situation should be managed. The suggestions had a common theme, that Cade's reservoir represented a resource that should be formally organized under a cooperative arrangement, and that the cooperative arrangement they had in mind had terms that heavily favored its organizers. Cade listened to these suggestions with the patience he'd developed for conversations he had no intention of taking seriously and steered them nowhere, which frustrated Voss in particular. Voss was a man accustomed to steering conversations toward conclusions he'd already decided on, and he found Cade's non-responses disorienting. "You're going to need allies when this gets worse," Voss told him at the Fenwick's gathering in early November. "And it's going to get worse." "Might," Cade said. "You want to be the man who sat on a full reservoir while the valley dried up?" "My reservoir has a capacity. People know what it is." "People know what you choose to share," Voss said. "That's what they know." Cade looked at him. "What are you suggesting?" Voss leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who'd anticipated this moment. "I'm suggesting that a formal arrangement, a consortium, call it what you want, puts the resource in a structure that protects everyone, including you." "Protects me from what?" Cade said. Voss smiled. "From decisions made in isolation." It was a threat dressed in the language of advice, which was Voss's preferred mode. Cade recognized it because he'd heard it before, from different mouths in different situations. The form was always the same, the warning about isolation that was really a warning about what would happen if you didn't join. He said, "I'll think about it," which meant no, and Voss understood it to mean no. And the meeting ended with more pleasantries that nobody meant. On the ride home, Cade thought about the easement he'd extended to the Ashford place, and about how that piece of information would read to Voss and Stokes and the others if they were assembling a picture of his intentions. It would look like the beginning of a different kind of alliance. Not the marriage and money consolidation they'd been pushing for, but something that moved resources laterally rather than upward, toward the smaller operations rather than toward the established interests. It wasn't what he'd intended when he rode out to the Ashford property that first time. He'd been acting on something instinctive, not strategic. But standing on the far side of it, he could see how it might become strategic if he chose to make it so. He rode home and didn't make any decisions about it. He fed his horses and checked the reservoir levels by lantern light, which he did every evening regardless of season, and went inside and ate the dinner he'd made for himself, which was beans and salt pork, the same thing he'd eaten the first winter he'd spent in this valley, a fact he was aware of without finding it particularly meaningful. He went to bed before 10 and lay in the dark listening to the wind come off the mountains, and thought about a woman who bought fence posts because she needed fence posts, and argued the price down to 21 cents because that was the right number and didn't apologize for knowing it. He had the thought, which he recognized as potentially foolish, that the valley was about to get a great deal more complicated, and that the complicated part was going to be interesting in a way that the uncomplicated part had not been for a long time. He was probably right about that. The wind that came off the mountains in November carried a particular quality of cold that the people of Red Hollow recognized as a warning. It wasn't the cold itself that worried them. They'd all survived cold before. It was the dryness in it, the way it pulled moisture out of the air and out of the ground, and out of everything it touched without giving anything back. Old-timers called it the hunger wind. It didn't have an official name. It didn't need one. Cade felt it every morning when he went out to check his horses, that dry bite at the back of his throat that meant the snowpack wasn't building the way it should. He checked his reservoir levels with increasing regularity, not out of alarm but out of the rancher's habit of knowing exactly what he had before he needed it. The numbers were holding. For now, the numbers were holding. What was not holding was the valley's patience. The ranchers who ran middle-sized operations, men like Denton Hale and Frank Purvis, who had enough to lose but not enough reserve to absorb a bad season, had begun showing up at Fenwick's with a different quality of worry than they'd carried in October. October worry was the kind you could talk through. November worry was the kind that had started doing the math on itself and didn't like the results. Cade was at Fenwick's on a Thursday when Denton Hale came in with ice on the brim of his hat and the look of a man who hadn't slept enough. He poured himself coffee without asking and sat down across from Cade and said, "I've got 40 head I can't water." "Your tank's out?" "Tank's got maybe 3 weeks in it, less if it gets warm and the evaporation picks up." Denton wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I need to sell or I need water, one or the other." "What's the market doing?" Cade asked. "Soft. Everybody's trying to sell down at the same time. You sell 40 head into a soft market right now, you're taking losses you won't recover until spring. If spring's better." He looked at Cade. "You've got the reservoir." Cade said nothing for a moment. He'd known this conversation was coming in some form. He'd known it since Voss had made his consortium pitch in early November, and he'd turned it sideways. The difference was that Denton Hale was not Voss. He wasn't maneuvering for structural advantage. He was a rancher with 40 thirsty cattle and a tank with 3 weeks left in it. "How far's your south pasture from my east fence line?" Cade asked. Denton thought about it. "1.5 miles, maybe." "That's a long pipe run." "I know it is." Cade drank his coffee. "Let me look at the grade between the properties. If it runs right, gravity might do most of the work and we could keep the pipe shallow. I'd need a week to assess it." Denton looked at him with the careful expression of someone trying to determine if he was being told yes or being managed. "And if the grade runs right?" "Then we talk about what a water-sharing arrangement looks like," Cade said. "Nothing's free and nothing's a favor. We put it on paper with terms both sides can live with." Denton nodded slowly. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was the marginally better feeling of a problem that might have a solution, which was different from the feeling that had walked in with him. Word of that conversation reached Voss within 2 days, which was faster than Cade had expected, but not faster than he should have expected. Fenwick's was not a place where private conversations stayed private. It was a place where conversations happened in front of witnesses, and the witnesses carried the information with them when they left. Voss came to see him on a Saturday. He came formally, which meant he came in his good coat and with a man named Carver, who was his ranch manager, and also his visible reminder that he employed people, which was his preferred way of expressing scale. They rode into Cade's yard mid-morning, and Cade was in the barn and heard them come and took his time walking out. "I heard you're extending water agreements to Denton Hale," Voss said. No greeting first, which told Cade the conversation had already started in Voss's head before he arrived. "I'm looking at whether the grade supports a pipeline," Cade said. "Haven't committed to anything." "You committed to the Ashford place." "Different circumstances." "Cade." Voss shifted his weight, and there was something in the movement that was almost conciliatory, which was more unsettling than his usual directness. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here because what you're doing has consequences beyond your property line, and you may not be seeing all of them." "What consequences?" "You start extending water bilaterally, one agreement at a time, you fragment the valley's resource management. You end up with a dozen private arrangements, all of them with different terms, none of them coordinated. When we hit a genuinely bad year, and we will, this valley always does, Those arrangements will conflict, and you'll have no framework to resolve the conflicts. It was not a stupid argument. Cade had thought about the version of it that applied to his own situation and had not found a completely satisfying counter to it. The problem was not the argument itself. The problem was who was making it and what structure they'd proposed as the alternative. The consortium you described to me last month, Cade said, would give Stokes and Waverly and your operation controlling interest in the distribution decisions. Proportional to investment, Voss said. Which means proportional to existing holdings, Cade said. Which means the smaller operations have consultation rights and no real authority. Voss was quiet for a moment. Some structures have to be built on the capacity that exists. Some structures, Cade said, are built to preserve what already exists. The silence that followed that was not comfortable. Carver looked at his boots. Voss looked at Cade with an expression that had moved past conciliatory and arrived somewhere cooler. You're going to make this harder than it needs to be, Voss said. Maybe, Cade said. I'll let you know what the grade looks like between my east line and Hale's south pasture. Voss and Carver rode out without further pleasantries, and Cade stood in his yard and watched them go and thought about the specific quality of the silence after a conversation that hadn't gone the way one party intended. It had a texture to it. He'd learned to pay attention to that texture. He rode out to assess the grade the following Monday, taking Ott with him because Ott had a surveyor's eye that was better than Cade's. They spent most of the day walking the line between the two properties, checking elevation changes and soil types and the most practical routing for a pipe. The grade was workable, not easy, not cheap, but workable. It would take more materials than the Ashford line had needed and more labor time, and the pipe run would have to cross a section of rocky ground that would make trenching hard. Doable, Ott said at the end of the day as they were riding back. Expensive doable. What's the alternative for Hale? Cade said. Selling cattle into a bad market, Ott said. Then it's not that expensive, Cade said. He put the arrangement to Denton Hale the following week, with terms written out on paper the way he'd done with Lena. Denton read them and asked 2 questions about the seasonal variability clause and signed. They shook hands on it, which Cade allowed because the paperwork already covered what the handshake was pretending to cover, and Denton went home looking like a man whose problem had gotten smaller, which was the best outcome available. By the time December came in, 3 more ranchers had approached Cade about similar arrangements. He turned 2 of them away, not because he didn't have the water, but because the property geography made a pipe connection impractical enough that the cost wouldn't serve the rancher's actual situation. He told them this plainly and suggested they consider selling down their herds temporarily instead, which was the less comfortable but more honest advice. The third, a woman named Clara Briggs, who ran a small sheep operation on the valley's western edge, had a geometry that might work if the line ran along an existing fence easement, and he agreed to look at it. He'd said nothing to Lena about any of this. She was not someone he reported his decisions to, and the decisions weren't about her. But he was aware, in the way that you're aware of a sound that might be significant before you've identified what it is, that the pattern he was building had a center of gravity that hadn't been deliberate when he started. She came to the ranch on a Wednesday with a problem she handled with characteristic directness. The connection fitting at her tank had developed a slow leak, and she'd patched it twice, and it was leaking again. "It's the fitting," she said, "not the patch material. The fitting itself is cracked." "I'll send Ott out with a replacement." "I can install it," she said, "if you have one that fits." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you know how to solder copper fitting?" "No," she said, "but I can learn in about 15 minutes if someone shows me." He almost argued with her, then didn't because there was no practical reason to. "Ott can show you when he brings the fitting," he said. "It's his preference to watch someone do it wrong once before he explains what right looks like, so be prepared for that." Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "I'll survive the pedagogical method." He looked at her. "You went to school." 2 years, she said. "Before my family—" She stopped. 2 years, she said again, differently. He didn't push it. He knew the shape of that kind of sentence. "I've got a fitting in the equipment barn. Wait, and I'll get it." He brought it out and she looked at it, examined the threading, confirmed it was the right size. Ott will be out Thursday, he said. Tell him I'll have coffee, she said. She was leaving the yard when he said, without having planned to say it, there are people who aren't happy about the agreements I've been making this winter. She stopped, turned. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel obligated to anything, he said. I'm telling you because it's likely you'll hear things about me, about your arrangement specifically, that I want you to have context for. She stood still for a moment, her hand on her mare's neck. What kind of things? That I have an agenda that isn't what it looks like, he said. That you've positioned yourself to benefit from it in some way that's not legitimate. Mabel Thorpe already started that conversation, she said flatly. This'll be different. This is Voss and Stokes. They have more reach than Mabel Thorpe and less scruple about where they aim. She absorbed this. Her expression hadn't changed. It remained the careful, neutral thing she wore in situations that required assessment. But her hand, the one that was resting on her mare's neck, had stilled completely. It was the stillness of someone who was angry and had decided not to show it yet. Why are you telling me this, she said. Because you came to my ranch that evening and told me you weren't what they were saying, he said. You thought I deserved to know the truth of the thing. I'm returning the courtesy. She stood there a moment longer. Something moved through her expression that he didn't have a name for, and it was gone before he could find one. All right, she said. She mounted. Thank you. She rode out and Cade went back to the barn and picked up what he'd been doing before she arrived, which was mending a split in a leather harness strap, and found that his hands were doing the work, but his attention was somewhere else entirely. Ott came in from the south pasture 20 minutes later, read the yard the way he always did, and said, Ashford girl was here? Fitting on her tanks cracked, Cade said. I need you to take a replacement out Thursday and show her the solder work. Yes, sir, Ott said. Then, Hale's talking about the agreement. Saying what? Saying you did right by him, Ott said. Said it to Purvis and Briggs and a few others. Said you put it in writing and kept to the terms and didn't attach conditions that showed up later. Cade kept working the harness. Good. Voss isn't happy about it. Voss is rarely happy about things he can't control, Cade said. Ott was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what you're doing, building out these agreements? Cade looked up at him. I'm not criticizing, Ott said quickly. I've been with you 14 years. You've never done something by accident. I'm asking if you know what you're building. Cade was quiet for a long moment. The harness strap in his hands was one he'd used for 11 years, repaired a dozen times, worn to the shape of the work it did. He knew every stress point on it. I know what I'm not building, he said finally. I'm not building what Voss wants built. That's a start, Ott said, and went to see to the horses and didn't ask anything else. The cold deepened through December. The snowpack did not improve. The creek that fed the valley's smaller tanks dropped to a trickle by the third week of the month, and Cade began running his reservoir numbers with the seriousness of someone who was no longer hypothetically managing a resource, but actually managing one. The math was still acceptable. His reserves were deeper than most people knew because he'd built the reservoir with a contingency margin that he'd never fully explained to anyone, including Ott. He'd built it deep because he'd lived through a season without enough water once, and he had no interest in living through it again. What he could not build deep enough against was what was coming from Voss's direction. He felt it the way you felt weather in the mountains, not yet visible but present in the pressure of things, in the way conversations shifted slightly when he entered Fenwick's, in the particular quality of Harlan Stokes's cordiality, which had become the cordiality of a man who'd been told to be patient. Something was being organized. He didn't know the shape of it yet. He knew the feeling. He rode out to the Ashford place on the last Saturday of December, not for any practical reason he could identify in advance, and found Lena in the yard again with the splitting maul, working through a section of oak rounds that were harder than the pine she usually split. Oak took more force and more precision, and she'd been at it long enough that her jacket was open despite the cold and her breath came in visible clouds. She stopped when she heard him and lowered the maul. The fittings holding? He said. Holding fine, she said. Ott did good work. You watched him close enough to repeat it? Probably, she said. He dismounted. He wasn't sure why he'd come out and was becoming aware that she might reasonably ask, so he said, I've been thinking about something and I wanted to know your read on it. She waited. If the consortium Voss is trying to build gets formalized, and I think they're moving that direction, the small operations in this valley lose effective water negotiating rights. The structure he wants gives controlling votes to the three largest holders. Everyone else gets a seat at a table where the decisions have already been made. I know, she said. I can do that math. The agreements I've been building, mine, bilaterally with the mid-size ranches, don't have the same reach. They protect the people in them, but they're not a structure. They're just a series of private arrangements. She looked at him steadily. What are you thinking? I'm thinking there might be a better structure, he said. Something that puts the smaller operations in a real position, not a courtesy position. But I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know enough about how to build a formal arrangement that holds legally under a challenge. Do you know someone who does? I know a man in the county seat who might, he said, but I haven't talked to him yet because I'm not certain it's the right move. Why tell me? She said. He thought about it. Honestly thought about it, not reaching for the diplomatic version. Because you're the one who made me see the thing clearly, he said. The easement I offered you. I thought I was doing something small, and then Voss started pushing back on it, and I started seeing what it actually was, what it could be. I don't know if I'd have seen it if you hadn't pushed me on the terms the way you did. She was quiet. The cold pressed in around them, and somewhere down toward the south fence, her grandfather's milk cow was making noise about something. The smaller ranchers have to want it, she said finally. You can't build it for them and hand it over. They have to want it enough to defend it. I know that. Hale will, she said. Briggs probably will. Purvis I don't know. The others depend on how bad the winter gets and whether they feel like they have anything to lose by not joining. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I think about everything that could affect this property, she said. It was almost the same thing she'd said to him in August when they first talked about the easement terms, and he recognized the echo of it, and he thought she probably did too, but neither of them acknowledged it. The winter's going to get worse before it gets better, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He remounted. He hadn't resolved anything by coming out, but he'd said it out loud to someone whose judgment he'd come to trust, in the specific way you trust someone who doesn't have anything to gain from agreeing with you. It had a clarifying effect, that kind of honesty. He'd forgotten what it felt like. I'll let you know what I find out from the man in the county seat, he said. All right, she said. He rode back toward his ranch through the cold and the dry, warning wind air, and the sense of something organizing itself in Voss's direction was still there, still unresolved. But there was also something else in him now that hadn't been there before he rode out. Not comfort, exactly. Nothing as soft as that. More like the feeling of knowing where the ground was solid when most of what you were standing on was uncertain. It wasn't nothing. In a winter like this one, in a valley that was tightening around its own anxiety, it was closer to everything. The man in the county seat was named Aldous Crew, and he was not impressive to look at. He was short and carried too much weight around the middle and wore spectacles that had been repaired at one hinge with a piece of wire that he'd never gotten around to replacing. He practiced land and water law out of a two-room office above a feed supply, and his bookshelves were so overcrowded that volumes had begun stacking horizontally on top of the vertical rows, giving the whole office the appearance of a place where order had been attempted and abandoned. Cade had known him for 6 years since a boundary dispute that Crew had resolved in his favor through a piece of legal reasoning so precise that the opposing party's lawyer had reportedly sat with the decision for 3 days before finding a way to live with it. He rode to the county seat on the second Monday of January, which put him on the road in temperatures cold enough that his horse's breath came out in long plumes, and the ground rang under the hooves. The ride took most of the morning. He arrived at Crew's office at 11:30 and found the lawyer eating a cold biscuit at his desk and reading something that he set face down when Cade came in the manner of a man who didn't want his reading interrupted but had just accepted that it would be. "Mercer," Crew said. "Sit down. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong yet," Cade said. He sat in the wooden chair across from the desk that existed specifically for clients and was slightly uncomfortable in a way Cade suspected was intentional. "I need to know what a formal water-sharing cooperative looks like under territorial law. whether it can be built to give equal decision rights to members regardless of holding size. Crew set the biscuit down and took his spectacles off and cleaned them with the edge of his vest, which Cade had noticed he did whenever a question required him to think before answering. "Who are you trying to protect it from?" "Voss," Cade said. "And Stokes. They're building a consortium that would centralize valley water management under the 3 largest holders. I want to know if there's a legal structure that preempts it." Crew put his spectacles back on. "You're asking if you can build something first. I'm asking if there's something worth building." "There's always something worth building," Crew said. "Whether it holds is the question." He turned in his chair and looked at his bookshelves for a moment with the specific focus of a man who knew where everything was, despite appearances. He pulled a volume and set it on the desk and did not open it immediately. A water-sharing cooperative can be structured with equal member votes. The problem is enforcement. If Voss files a challenge claiming prior appropriation rights, you need the other members to be signatories who can demonstrate beneficial use. If any of them have gaps in their documentation, some will, Cade said. Then Voss uses those gaps as leverage, Crew said. He doesn't have to win the whole case. He just has to make it expensive enough that the smaller members settle out. Cade had expected this. He'd turned the problem over during the weeks between his conversation with Lena and this ride, and the version of it he'd arrived at was close to what Crew was describing. What if the documentation gaps were addressed before the cooperative was formalized? Crew looked at him over the spectacles. That's a significant amount of work. How significant? Each property with a gap would need a survey record, a demonstrated use history, and a formal filing. Some of those filings would face objections. You'd need someone in this office working on it for, he calculated, 2 months minimum, possibly 3. What would that cost? Crew told him. It was not a number that was comfortable, but it was a number that was possible. Cade sat with it for a moment and then said, "Start with the properties that are most exposed. I'll give you the list." Crew looked at him for a long moment. "You're paying for this yourself?" "Yes." "The ranchers you're protecting, do they know that?" "Not yet," Cade said, "and I'd prefer they not know it until it's done. If they know someone else is covering the legal costs, some of them will feel beholden, and that'll change how they participate in the cooperative." Crew was quiet. He had the expression of a man evaluating something that had more dimensions than the legal ones. "This'll make enemies," he said. "Voss isn't someone who absorbs a loss and moves on. I know that." "All right," Crew said. He opened the volume on his desk. "Give me the list." Cade rode home in the afternoon cold and arrived back at his ranch as the light was failing, and fed his horse, and checked the reservoir and went inside and sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote down the names of every operation in Red Hollow Valley that he knew to have documentation problems, which was 7 properties. And then he looked at the list for a while and added an 8th that he wasn't certain about, but thought might have an issue with a survey line. And then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket to send to Crew in the morning. He hadn't told Lena he was going to the county seat. He hadn't told her what he was spending. He thought about whether she'd want to know, and decided she would, but that the knowing would create an obligation she'd feel and hadn't asked for, and that was not a thing he was willing to put on her. Not yet. Not without understanding better what the thing between them was or wasn't, which was itself a question he was not ready to examine directly. February arrived the way bad seasons always arrive. Not in a single dramatic event, but in an accumulation of small things that individually seem manageable and collectively did not. The creek that fed the valley's smaller tanks stopped running entirely in the first week of the month. 2 ranchers who had not been part of Cade's bilateral agreements, men who had held back waiting to see which way the wind blew, lost significant portions of their cattle to dehydration before they could move the animals to alternate water. One of them, a man named Croft, sold his entire herd at ruinous prices and began quietly talking to real estate brokers about the land. Voss bought Croft's eastern 40 acres within the week. He didn't buy it himself. He bought it through a land company that had a different name, but that Cade recognized from a filing he'd seen in Crew's office the previous year. It was a clean piece of work, the kind that was technically legal and ethically instructive. At Fenwick's, the conversation about the water situation had acquired a new urgency that Cade could feel in the room the moment he walked in. Denton Hale was there, and Frank Purvis, and two of the smaller ranchers whose paperwork Crew was working on, and they all had the look of men who were managing their fear by converting it into practical discussion, which was the best any of them could do. "Voss is moving," Purvis said when Cade sat down. He said it without preamble because everyone in the room understood the context. He bought Crofts Acreage. That land gives him access to the northern drainage. "I know," Cade said. "He's going to use it to argue natural flow rights," Hale said. "If he controls the northern drainage and the seasonal flow rates, he'll have a legal basis to claim priority on anything that runs through it." "Crew's working on that," Cade said. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when information lands that changes the shape of what people thought they were discussing. Hale looked at him. "You've talked to Crew?" "Yes." "About what, specifically?" Cade looked around the room. Purvis, Hale, two men named Jacobs and Terrell, and old Marcus Finn, who ran the sheep operation on the valley floor and rarely said anything but missed nothing. "About building a formal cooperative," he said. "One with equal member votes and documented beneficial use filings for every member property. Something that gives this room legal standing to challenge a priority claim." The silence after that was different. Not the silence of surprise, but the silence of people doing rapid private calculations. "That takes time," Terrell said. He was cautious by nature, a man who wore worry like a second coat. "Voss isn't waiting." "Crew's already started the filings," Cade said. Terrell looked at him. "Who's paying for that?" "I am," Cade said. "For now. We'll settle accounts when the cooperative is formalized and people have had a chance to assess what they're joining. Nobody's obligated to anything by the legal work." Purvis said, "That's a significant amount of money to spend on people who haven't committed to anything." "Yes," Cade said. "Why?" Cade thought about how to say it cleanly. "Because Voss winning this valley isn't good for anyone in this room, including me. And because I have more resources than most of you to spend on stopping it." He paused. "That's not charity. That's risk management." Marcus Finn, who had not spoken, said, "What do you need from us?" "Paperwork," Cade said. "Any boundary survey records you have? Any documentation of water use going back as far as you have it? Crew needs the primary sources. If you don't have them, tell him that, and he'll work with what can be established through testimony." The meeting lasted another hour. Nobody committed to anything formally, but nobody walked out either, which in Red Hollow Valley was the closest thing to consensus you were likely to get before the thing being decided had proven itself worth deciding on. It was Ott who saw it first. He came into the barn on a Thursday evening in mid-February while Cade was repairing tack, and his face had the particular economy of expression that meant something was wrong and he was deciding how to say it. "Someone's been at the reservoir," Ott said. Cade set down what he was working on. "Define been at." "East inlet pipe. Someone's pulled the valve housing and repacked the seal. It's not quite right. Flow's reduced. Maybe a quarter of what it should be." "When?" "Last day or two. I noticed it this afternoon. Thought it was settling until I looked at the housing." Cade walked out to the reservoir with a lantern. The evening was cold enough that his fingers went stiff in the time it took to examine the inlet housing, and what he found was exactly what Ott had described. Someone had accessed the valve mechanism, and what they'd packed back in was not the original seal material. It was close. It was close enough that a casual inspection wouldn't flag it. But the flow rate through that inlet fed the primary distribution lines, and a reduction of 25% over a sustained period would affect every agreement he'd made with the bilateral ranchers. He stood there in the cold with the lantern and felt something that he was careful with because he recognized it as anger, and anger in a situation like this one had to be managed precisely, or it made you stupid. "Fix the seal," he said, "and check the secondary inlet tomorrow morning." "Already planning on it," Ott said. "Don't tell anyone yet. I need to know the full scope before this becomes a conversation." He told Lena the next morning. He rode out early, before the day had properly decided what kind of day it was going to be, and found her hauling water from her tank to the garden beds she was prepping for early spring planting, which was optimistic of her given that there was still frost on the ground most mornings. She looked up when she heard his horse and read his face with the speed she'd developed for reading things that mattered. "Something happened," she said. "Someone tampered with my reservoir inlet, reduced the flow." She set down the water bucket. Voss. Probably. Can't prove it yet. What does it mean for the agreements you have? If it stays reduced, the bilateral arrangements get thin by March. Not broken, but thin. If there are multiple points of interference, he stopped. I need you to check your fitting, the connection at your tank. She went and checked it while he waited, and came back with a look on her face he hadn't seen before. Not exactly anger, something harder than that. Someone's been at it, she said. The solder joint on the intake side, it's been worked and put back. Is it leaking? Not yet, but it will be. He dismounted and they went back to look at it together, and Cade saw what she was describing. The joint had been partially separated and repressed without proper heat, which meant it was holding on the cold weld strength of the metal contact rather than the solder. When the temperature cycled, warm days, cold nights, the joint would fail. Maybe slowly, maybe fast, depending on the pressure. We need to resolder it today, he said. I know how, she said. Ott showed me. While she worked on the joint, Cade stood and thought about the geometry of what was happening. The inlet tampering at his reservoir, the joint interference at Lena's connection, those weren't random. Those were 2 points of a deliberate pattern. And if 2 points, then likely more. How's your grandfather? He said. She looked up from the joint, heat tool in hand. Why? Because if this escalates, I want to know if he's mobile enough to move if he needs to. Her jaw tightened. He doesn't need to move. This is his property. I'm not suggesting he should, Cade said. I'm asking a practical question. She held the heat to the joint for a moment before answering. He can move if he has to. He won't be happy about it. Nobody's going to be happy about any of this, Cade said. He rode to each of the bilateral agreement properties that day, checking connections where he could access them without making it obvious what he was looking for. He found interference at Hale's south line, a valve partially closed on the supply side which Hale hadn't noticed because his tank was still showing adequate levels, but which would have drained it by March. He found a cut in the Jacobs line that had been buried well enough that it would have read as a freeze failure when it let go in a cold snap. By the time he got back to his ranch that evening, he had 4 confirmed points of interference and 2 suspected ones. Ott met him in the yard with a look that said he'd been sitting on something all day. Secondary inlet, Ott said. Same thing. Different packing material this time. Cade stood in the cold yard and added it up. 6 points, maybe 8. This was coordinated work, done by people who knew the infrastructure well enough to interfere with it precisely, and done at enough locations simultaneously that the failures would compound rather than be individually traceable. I need to get to crew, he said. Tonight? He thought about the ride. 2 hours each way, in the dark, in this cold. He thought about what crew could do tonight that he couldn't do in the morning. Tomorrow, he said, before dawn. He went inside and ate something he didn't taste and tried to sleep and mostly didn't. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and lit the lamp and sat at his kitchen table and wrote out everything he'd found with descriptions and locations in the precise detail of a man who had understood from the first moment that this was going to become a legal and not just a practical problem. He was still writing when he heard hoofbeats in the yard, which at 2 in the morning was not a sound that meant anything good. He went to the door with the lamp and opened it. Lena was in the yard on her mare, and the mare was blowing hard from a fast ride, and behind Lena in the direction of the eastern valley, the sky had a color that had nothing to do with the time of night. Fire, she said. Her voice was level in the way voices go level when someone has gone past the first shock of something and arrived at the part where there are things to do. My outbuilding and the south fence line. We got grandfather out. But Cade, she stopped, steadied. The wind's coming north. If it jumps to the main structure, he was already moving. He was shouting for Ott before she finished, pulling his coat on, going for the horses, and the part of his mind that was always running the calculations, even when the rest of him was in motion, was registering the date and the wind direction and the location and the fact that this was not an accident, that someone had waited for a night with the right wind and the right dry conditions and had chosen the Ashford property specifically, and that whoever had chosen it had understood exactly what it would cost her. Ott came out of the bunkhouse at a run and read the situation from the light in the sky without needing it, explained. Rollo was behind him, still pulling his coat on, and the three of them were mounted and moving within 4 minutes of Lena arriving in the yard, riding hard through the dark toward a horizon that was getting brighter in all the wrong ways. The outbuilding was fully involved by the time they arrived, a dry timber structure that had caught completely and was throwing sparks in the north wind toward the cabin. Elias was in the yard in his coat and boots, standing with the posture of a man who refused to be less than upright even in catastrophe, watching his property burn with an expression that Cade would not forget. Not grief exactly, something older and more controlled than grief. The face of a man who had absorbed losses before and was absorbing this one. Lena was already at the water barrel near the cabin wall, soaking blankets with the methodical urgency of someone who had assessed the situation and identified the most immediate threat. She'd gotten her chickens out. Cade could hear them somewhere in the dark, agitated. And the milk cow was tied to the far fence post, pulling at the rope. They worked through the rest of the night. The outbuilding could not be saved. They didn't try. They worked to keep the cabin, laying wet blankets along the south-facing wall and beating back sparks with feed sacks, and keeping the water barrel supplied from the tank that still had water because the fitting had been resoldered that morning. Cade registered that fact with a cold clarity that had no room in it for relief. By 4 in the morning, they'd broken the fire's momentum. The outbuilding was ash and glowing timber. The cabin stood. The south fence line had burned for 100 yards before the ground moisture stopped it. Lena stood at the edge of the ash with a feed sack in her hand and looked at what was left of the outbuilding. The stored feed, 2 sets of tools, a replacement harness, 2 seasons' worth of equipment that wasn't insured against anything. Her face in the firelight was the face of someone who was not going to fall apart, and who was also not going to pretend this was anything other than what it was. "The grain," she said. It wasn't a question. "We'll replace it," Cade said. She looked at him. Her eyes were red from smoke and there was ash on her jaw. "We." "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked to where Elias was standing and put her arm around the old man's shoulders, and Elias put his hand over hers, and they stood there looking at the ruin of a winter's work, while the sky in the east began very slowly to go gray. Ott came to stand beside Cade. Neither of them said anything for a while. "This is what Voss's patience looked like," Ott said finally. "Yes," Cade said. "What are you going to do?" Cade looked at the ash. He looked at the old man and the young woman standing at the edge of it. He thought about the notes he'd been writing at 2 in the morning, the documentation of 6 points of infrastructure interference, the money already spent with crew, the list of properties whose paperwork was being assembled into something that could stand a legal challenge. He thought about everything he'd been building carefully and quietly, and he thought about whether quiet was still the right approach. "I'm going to crew," he said. "Today. And then I'm going to stop being quiet about it." He rode to the county seat at first light, arriving at Crew's office before the lawyer had finished his morning coffee. Crew took one look at him, the ash still on his coat, the sleepless set of his jaw, and closed the door behind him without being asked. Cade laid everything on the desk, the written notes he'd been making at 2 in the morning, the descriptions of each interference point, the locations, the materials used, the timeline as best he could reconstruct it. Then he described the fire, the wind direction, the timing, the specific targeting of the outbuilding rather than the cabin, which suggested someone who had wanted to destroy resources without creating a situation serious enough to draw immediate territorial law involvement. Crew listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Cade valued about him. He didn't perform concern. He gathered information. When Cade finished, Crew sat back and looked at the notes for a long moment. "The infrastructure tampering is documented," he said. "You have physical evidence at multiple sites." "Yes." "The fire is harder. Arson requires establishing intent and origin. If the origin point burned completely, the physical evidence may be ambiguous." "The origin point was the south wall of the outbuilding," Cade said, "the wall that faced away from the prevailing wind. A fire that started from an ember or a stove accident would have caught on the windward side." Crew looked at him. "You noticed that at 4 in the morning." "I noticed things," Cade said. "All right." Crew made a note. "That's useful if a territorial inspector corroborates it. I can request an inspection." He set his pen down. "What do you want to accomplish, Cade, specifically?" I want the cooperative filings accelerated. Whatever you need from me to make that happen faster, I'll provide it. That's already moving as fast as it can move without errors we'd regret, Crew said. Errors are what they'll look for. Then I want to know what Voss's actual legal exposure is, Cade said, if the tampering can be connected to him. Crew was quiet for a moment. Conspiracy to damage property. Possibly fraud, if the goal was to create conditions that would depress land values and force sales. The Croft purchase would become relevant. He paused. It's a significant exposure, if the evidence supports it. What do you need? Witnesses, Crew said. Physical evidence is strong for the tampering. For the fire and for the coordination of the scheme, you need someone who has direct knowledge of what was planned and by whom. Cade thought about that on the ride back. Witnesses were the hard part. Voss was not a man who did his own physical work when it came to this kind of thing. He used intermediaries, and intermediaries used their own men. And the chain between Voss's intentions and the hands that had actually pulled valve housings and worked solder joints and touched a flame to dry timber was long enough that it was designed to be untraversable, unless someone in that chain had a reason to talk. He did not go back to his ranch directly. He went to Denton Hale's place first, arriving mid-morning to find Hale in his barn with a look that said word had already reached him about the fire. News moved fast in Red Hollow Valley. It always had. I heard about the Ashford place, Hale said. The girl all right? She's all right. Her grandfather's all right. The outbuilding's gone. Yes. Cade looked at Hale steadily. You know about the valve on your south line. Hale's jaw tightened. Noticed it this morning when my tank wasn't reading where it should. I went and looked. He paused. That was deliberate. Yes. Voss. I think so. I need to prove it. Hale was quiet for a moment, working his hat brim in his hands in the way men work something when they're deciding something. What do you need from me? A written statement about the valve. When you noticed it, what you found, what condition the housing was in. Cade paused. And anything you know about who Voss uses when he needs physical work done off his books. Hale looked up. That's a different kind of statement. Yes. Another pause. There's a man named Burl who works seasonal labor through the valley. He's worked for Voss's outfit before. He worked for me one season 3 years ago. Did a decent job, actually. But he talks when he's had enough whiskey, and what he said on a couple of occasions at the Landmark is that Voss pays extra for certain kinds of jobs. You've heard this personally. I was at the same table, Hale said. So was Marcus Finn. Cade filed that. Marcus Finn, who said little at Fenwick's and missed nothing. Would you put what you heard in a written statement? Hale turned his hat over once more. He was a man who understood what saying yes to that question meant in a town where Voss had reach. He was also a man who had 40 cattle whose water security depended on a valve that someone had deliberately interfered with. Yes, he said. I'll put it in writing. Cade found Marcus Finn at his sheep operation that same afternoon. The old man was patching a section of his lambing shelter alone, working with the careful patience of someone who had been doing physical repairs for 50 years and had lost the need to hurry through them. He listened to what Cade said without stopping his work. When Cade finished, Finn set down his hammer and looked at him. I know what Burl said, Finn told him. I was there. Would you put it in a statement? Finn picked up a nail and held it between two fingers, examining it. Voss bought the Croft property, he said. He's going to come for mine next, you know. My land's in a position he wants for the drainage argument. I know that. A statement implicating him in criminal conduct. If this goes badly, if the case doesn't hold... Finn stopped. I'm 71 years old. I don't have the reserves to survive a legal fight with that man. I know that too, Cade said. I'm not asking you to fight the legal fight. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you heard. Crew handles the rest. Finn was quiet for a long time. The sheep in the near pen moved around with their characteristic indifference to human drama. Finally, Finn said, My father lost everything to a man like Voss, back east. We moved out here because there wasn't anything left to stay for. He picked up his hammer again. I'll write the statement. Over the following week, Cade moved through the valley with a methodical patience that he recognized as the same patience he brought to any large job. The fall gather, the reservoir construction, the years of incremental land acquisition that had built his operation from 40 acres to 4,000. Large jobs required you to break them into pieces and work the pieces without losing sight of what the pieces were building toward. He gathered statements. He connected crew with the property owners whose documentation was thinnest. He had Ott make a detailed inspection of every piece of infrastructure associated with his bilateral agreements and document the findings in writing that Ott signed and dated. He was not quiet about it. This was the change from before. He let people see him riding from property to property, let the conversations happen in front of witnesses, let it be known at Fenwick's that a legal process was underway without specifying its precise shape. He wanted Voss to know that the quiet period was over. He wanted that information to create pressure that might loosen something in Voss's chain of intermediaries. He wasn't sure it would work. He thought it was worth trying. Lena and Elias were staying in the cabin, which had survived intact. The outbuilding's loss was serious. The stored feed was irreplaceable until he could bring in a supply load from the county seat, which he arranged through Crew's office on the second day. But the cabin itself was sound, and Elias was not a man who was going to be relocated by a fire. Cade came to the Ashford place 3 times that week, which was more than he'd come in any previous week, and each time he came with something practical. The feed supply, then materials for a temporary shelter to replace the outbuilding's most critical storage function, then Ott and Rollo to help put the temporary structure up. He told himself these were practical responses to a practical situation, which was true and also not the whole truth, and he was honest enough with himself to know that. On the third day, when Ott and Rollo had gone and Elias had gone inside to rest his leg, Lena and Cade stood at the edge of where the outbuilding had been and looked at the temporary structure they'd put up in its place. Adequate, functional, not pretty. "I've been thinking about the statement Crew needs," she said. He looked at her. "I was awake when the fire started," she said. "I heard something before I saw the light, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not an animal." She paused. "I didn't think about it in the moment because I was focused on getting grandfather out, but I've been thinking about it since." "What kind of sound?" "Boots on frozen ground," she said, moving away from the south wall, fast. She looked at him steadily. "I know what I heard." "That's a significant thing to put in a statement," he said. "It puts you in a position if this goes to a formal proceeding." "I know what position I'm in," she said. "I've been in a position since Mabel Thorpe opened her mouth in October. Being in a position is not new to me." She paused. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because someone burned down my outbuilding, and I intend to say so clearly to any authority with the standing to hear it." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face that was past tired and past angry, and had arrived at a kind of clear-eyed determination that he recognized because he'd felt it himself at certain points in his life. The feeling of having had enough taken from you that the cost of fighting back no longer seemed disproportionate to the cost of not fighting back. "I'll have Crew come to you," he said, "or you can go to him, whichever is easier." "I'll go to him," she said. "I'd rather not have Voss's people see a lawyer coming out here." It was the right calculation. He was glad she'd made it herself. She went to Crew 2 days later, riding to the county seat alone and returning in the afternoon, and she came by his ranch on the way back because his property was between the county seat and hers. She tied her horse at his fence and came to the porch where he was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and sat down on the step without being invited, which was the first time she'd done that. "He's thorough," she said, about Crew. "He is. He asked good questions." She looked out at the yard. "He also told me you've been paying the legal costs for the other properties." Cade said nothing. "You didn't tell me that," she said. "No." "Why not?" He thought about the answer he'd given himself when he was making the decision, the part about obligation and what it created. He said it to her plainly, because she was not someone who was well served by diplomatic versions. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "I would have wanted to know." "I know," he said. "I made the wrong call." She turned and looked at him, which was direct enough that he felt it. Don't make decisions for me about what I can handle knowing, she said. I'd rather know and be uncomfortable than not know and find out later. Understood, he said. She looked back at the yard. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that follows an honest exchange and takes a moment to settle. Crew thinks the case is strong, she said. If Burl talks. Burl's the variable, Cade said. Everything else is circumstantial until someone in Voss's chain confirms the coordination. What makes someone like Burl talk? Fear, usually, or money, or both. Cade turned his cold coffee cup in his hands, or the sense that the thing he's been part of is going to collapse, and he wants to be on the right side of it when it does. Which do you think it'll be? I think Voss is going to make a mistake, Cade said. Men like him usually do when they feel the ground shifting. They overreach. He was right about that, though it happened in a way he hadn't specifically anticipated. Voss came to Fenwick's on a Thursday in late February, which was unusual. He generally conducted his business through intermediaries or at the more formal setting of the county administrative offices. His coming to Fenwick's meant he wanted an audience, which told Cade something about his current state of mind. Hale was there, and Purvis, and Jacobs, and several of the smaller ranchers whose paperwork Crew was working on. Cade was there, sitting at the back table with a cup of coffee, and he'd been there for 20 minutes before Voss arrived, which meant he had a read on the room's mood before the conversation started. Voss sat down without being invited and looked at Cade with the expression of a man who had decided to stop being patient. I understand you've been filing documents with Crew's office, Voss said. My affairs are my own, Cade said. When your affairs involve interfering with established water rights in this valley, they're not just your own. Nobody's interfering with established rights, Cade said. We're establishing rights that should have been documented years ago. You're building a structure designed to block legitimate resource management, Voss said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. Cade could see it in the set of his shoulders. And you're doing it by extending resources to people who can't sustain their own operations without charity. The word you keep using wrong, Hale said, from 2 seats down the table, is charity. He said it without looking up from his coffee, which made it land harder than if he'd turned to face Voss directly. What Cade's built is a business arrangement. We all signed papers. We all have terms. Voss looked at Hale with the look of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about a room. He'd expected the smaller ranchers to be deferential, or at least quiet. Hale was neither. The terms won't hold under a proper legal examination, Voss said. Then examine them, Cade said. He kept his voice level because raising it would signal that Voss was getting something from him. Take them to the territorial court. We'll see what holds. The room had gone very still. It was not the comfortable stillness of people who weren't interested. It was the attentive stillness of people who were watching something develop and wanted to see how it resolved. Voss stood up. He looked around the room with the deliberateness of a man making sure his audience understood they were being assessed. Then he looked at Cade. You've overextended yourself, he said. People who overextend in this valley end up the way Croft ended up. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Purvis said quietly, Did he just threaten you in front of 8 people? Yes, Cade said. That was stupid, Purvis said. It was, Cade said. He was already thinking about the 8 people who had just heard it, and about how that sentence, you'll end up the way Croft ended up, was going to read in the context of a legal proceeding that was building a picture of coordinated pressure against valley landowners. Croft had not been ruined by accident. Croft had been ruined deliberately, and Voss had just, in front of witnesses, indicated that he knew how it had happened. He went to find Ott that evening and sent him to the landmark with instructions to find out whether Burl was there, and if he was, to buy him a drink and let the man talk. Ott came back 2 hours later and said, Burl wasn't at the landmark, but somebody else was. One of Voss's junior hands, young man named Eddie, maybe 20 years old. He'd had enough to drink that he wasn't careful. Ott paused. He was talking about how things had gotten too serious, how he'd signed up for valve work, not fires. Cade looked at him. Those words specifically. Near enough, Ott said. Finn's son was at the bar. He heard it. Cade rode to Crew's office the next morning. Not at dawn this time. At 8 after a proper night's sleep, because this was the kind of conversation that required a clear head and the patience to let the legal process do what legal processes did. Crew's response to the information about Eddie was methodical and not visibly excited, which was appropriate. He made notes. He asked questions about the young man's last name, his connection to Voss's outfit, the other people present in the bar. He said, "If young Eddie is frightened enough to talk in public, he may be frightened enough to talk formally. I'll have someone approach him with an offer of limited immunity in exchange for a full account." "Will that work?" Cade asked. "It might," Crew said. "Young men who've gotten into something more serious than they intended often respond to the offer of a way out." He looked over his spectacles. "It's not guaranteed." "Nothing's guaranteed," Cade said. "No," Crew agreed, "but the picture we're building is becoming harder to argue against. 8 witnesses to Voss's statement at Fenwick's. Physical evidence of infrastructure tampering at 6 sites. Lena Ashford's testimony about what she heard before the fire. Hale and Finn's statements about what Burl said." He paused. "And the Croft purchase, which looks worse the more you document the surrounding context." "How long?" Cade said. "To file formally?" Crew considered. 3 weeks. Maybe 4, if Eddie needs convincing. The cooperative documents are nearly ready. I want to file everything together. The cooperative formation and the complaint against Voss, because together they tell a coherent story that separately they don't. 3 weeks. Cade thought about what 3 weeks looked like in a valley where the water situation was still thin, where the fire damage to the Ashford property was still raw, where Voss was now making threats in public that were only threats if he didn't follow through on them, and something more serious if he did. He rode home through the February cold and stopped at the Ashford place on the way, not because he had news that required sharing, but because he was finding that the Ashford place had become a stop on his internal map of the valley in a way that was separate from the legal and practical things that connected them. Elias was on the porch when he arrived, sitting in a chair with a blanket over his legs and a pipe he wasn't smoking, just holding. It was cold to be on the porch, but Elias was not a man who stayed indoors if he could avoid it. He looked up when Cade dismounted. "She's inside," Elias said, which Cade had not asked. "I came to tell you where things stand," Cade said, which was also true. He sat on the porch step, the same step where Lena had sat 2 weeks ago, and he told Elias what Crew had said about the timeline. Elias listened the way he'd read the easement document, with the patience of a man who wanted to understand all of it before he responded to any of it. When Cade finished, Elias said, "You've spent a considerable amount of money on this valley." "Yes." "On people who aren't your family and aren't your business partners." Cade looked out at the yard, at the temporary shelter that wasn't pretty but was standing. "The valley's my home," he said. "What happens to it happens to me eventually." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said. "But it's not the whole reason." Cade didn't answer that because the honest answer was complicated, and he wasn't sure the porch of a man's house was the right place to give it. He heard the cabin door open behind him and knew without turning that it was Lena. She came around and stood at the edge of the porch and looked at him with the direct attention she gave everything that required assessment. "Crew has what he needs?" she said. "Almost," he said. 3 or 4 weeks. She nodded. She was looking at the temporary shelter, the way she often looked at the things that had been damaged or lost. Not with sentiment, but with the calculating attention of someone already planning the next practical step. "The outbuilding," she said. "When this is done, when there's time and resources, I want to build it properly, not just replace what was there." "Bigger?" he said. "Better positioned," she said. "The old one was too close to the south fence. If there's ever a windfire again from that direction—" She stopped. "I want it where it won't be the thing that catches first." He looked at her, at the way she was already redesigning around the loss, already thinking about how to make the next version harder to destroy. It was the most her thing she'd ever done, and he thought he understood her better in that moment than he had in all the months of negotiation and legal maneuvering and shared hard work. "I'll help you build it," he said. She looked at him, and for once her expression didn't do the careful closing thing it usually did when something he said required a response she hadn't prepared. She just looked at him with a face that was tired and ash-smudged from the morning's chores and honest in a way that made him feel like he was seeing the thing she kept behind the practical efficiency. "All right," she said. Elias said nothing. He just put his unlit pipe back in his mouth and looked at the yard, and his expression, for the first time since the fire, had something in it that was close to ease. Eddie talked. It took Crew's man 3 visits and the formal offer of limited immunity, but on the 4th day of March, a young man who had spent 2 months carrying the weight of something that had grown far past what he'd agreed to sat down in Crew's office and gave a full account. He was 22 years old and had taken the valve work because Voss's foreman had told him it was a water management adjustment, which he'd half believed because believing it was easier than asking the questions that would have made him responsible for the answers. The fire had changed that. Nobody had told him about the fire. He'd found out the way everyone else had, through the talk at the landmark. And what he'd felt when he heard it was the feeling of a man who understands too late the nature of the thing he's been part of. He named the foreman, he named Burrell, he named 2 other men who had worked the sites with him, and he described, in the careful detail of someone who wanted to be believed, a conversation he'd overheard between the foreman and Voss himself, in which the fire had not been ordered but had been permitted. Voss had said specifically that whatever happened to the Ashford property was not his concern, which was a sentence that meant exactly what it meant when you understood the context it was spoken in. Crew filed the cooperative documents and the formal complaint against Voss on the same day, in the 3rd week of March, as he'd promised. The filing landed in the territorial court with the accumulated weight of everything that had been built behind it. 8 witness statements, physical evidence from 6 interference sites, Lena's testimony, Eddie's full account, the documented pattern of land acquisition that included the Croft purchase, and the paper trail showing the land company Voss had used for that acquisition was the same company registered to his wife's brother in a filing that Crew had found by following a chain of references that went 3 documents deep before it resolved. It was thorough in the way that things are thorough when someone who knows what they're doing has had enough time to do it properly. Crew was not dramatic about it. He sent Cade a letter describing what had been filed and what the likely response timeline would be. Cade read the letter at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and then put it in the leather folder where he kept documents that mattered and went out to check his reservoir levels, which was what he did every morning regardless of what else was happening. The valley had begun to change by then in ways that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings. February had given way to March, and March had brought snow. Not the thin, dry snow of the previous months, but actual accumulation, the kind that settled into the mountains and stayed, building the snowpack that the valley needed. The creek that had stopped running in early February began again in the 2nd week of March, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as the melt above the ridgeline fed into it. Cade watched his reservoir rise with the satisfaction of a man who has run the numbers enough times to know what each inch of depth means in practical terms. It meant the bilateral agreements would hold through spring. It meant the smallest operations in the valley had a margin they hadn't had in months. It meant that whatever happened in the territorial court, the immediate crisis had broken. He told Lena this on a Thursday when he rode out, ostensibly to check the pipe connection at her tank, which had been running fine since February and needed no checking. She knew why he'd really come. She had a way of knowing that without making it awkward, which he appreciated. She made coffee, not the bitter camp coffee he made for himself, but something that suggested she'd paid attention at some point to how coffee was supposed to taste. And they sat at the kitchen table while Elias napped in the back room, and Cade told her what Crew had filed and what Eddie had said and what the legal timeline looked like. She listened the way she always listened, with the full stillness of someone who was actually processing rather than just waiting for her turn to respond. "Voss will fight it," she said when he finished. "He will," Cade said. "He has money for lawyers and the inclination to spend it. Crew says 18 months, possibly 2 years before a final disposition. And in the meantime, the cooperative is formally constituted, which gives the member properties legal standing to challenge any resource management claims he files. He can't move in the valley the way he was moving before." He paused. "It won't be comfortable. It won't be fast. But the ground's different now than it was in January." She turned her coffee cup on the table, a small rotation she did when she was thinking. "Eddie," she said, "the young man who talked. What happens to him? Limited immunity for his testimony. He'll likely leave the valley. The foreman and Burl won't be generous toward him when this surfaces publicly. Crew's trying to ensure his account is in the formal record before that becomes a problem. He was 22, she said. It wasn't a defense exactly. It was an observation with some complexity behind it. Yes, Cade said. People do things they don't fully understand when they're that age, and someone they work for frames it as ordinary. She looked at the table. That's not absolution. It's how it works. He looked at her. It was the kind of thing she said sometimes, a precise observation about human behavior that had the quality of something thought about rather than received, something she'd worked out from her own experience of people doing things for reasons that were complicated and not entirely their own. He'd come to expect these observations from her and to value them in a way he didn't entirely have language for. The Valley's going to know about all of it soon, he said. Crew's filings are public record once they're entered. What Voss did, what Eddie said, the fire. All of it. She looked up. Good, she said. It was quiet and without performance, the word of someone who had been doubted and talked about and placed in a category she hadn't chosen and was satisfied to let the truth replace all of that. The Valley did find out. Not all at once. Truth in a small community arrives the way water finds its level, through the available channels and at the pace those channels allow. But within a month of Crew's filing, the shape of what had happened was common knowledge in Red Hollow. The specifics varied in their accuracy, depending on who was telling it and how many hands the information had passed through. What held consistent across every version was the essential fact. Voss and his people had tampered with the valley's water infrastructure and permitted a fire to destroy an old man's property, and they had done it to consolidate control of a resource that belonged to everyone. Mabel Thorpe, who had positioned herself at the leading edge of the rumors about Lena in October, was conspicuously quiet when the legal filings became public. Cade noticed this and found it neither satisfying nor unsatisfying. He had not spent any of his patience on Mabel Thorpe since October, and he did not start now. She was a version of something that existed in every small community. A person who filled uncertainty with interpretation and found it difficult to revise the interpretation when the uncertainty resolved. She wasn't malicious the way Voss was malicious. She was just the other kind of problem. What Cade noticed more was how Lena moved through Red Hollow in the weeks that followed the filing. She had always been present in town. She came for market days, for supplies, for the practical business of running a homestead. But the quality of her presence had been peripheral. She was noticed but not included. She was discussed but not spoken to directly by the people doing the discussing. Now that changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulating way that genuine social change happens, one conversation at a time. Denton Hale's wife stopped her at the market in late March and asked, specifically and practically, whether there were aspects of the water cooperative's documentation process that residents who weren't ranchers should understand. It was a question that acknowledged Lena's knowledge as legitimate and sought it out, which was different from everything that had come before. Clara Briggs, whose sheep operation had been formalized into the cooperative structure, invited her to supper. Purvis, who had said little to her directly in all the months they'd been peripherally connected through Cade's arrangements, tipped his hat to her on the street in a way that was not the reflexive courtesy you extended to anyone, but the specific acknowledgement of someone you'd assessed and found worth acknowledging. She told Cade about the Briggs supper on a Sunday afternoon in April, when the weather had finally remembered that spring was a gentler season than winter. They were outside, at the Ashford property, where Cade had come to begin the planning conversation about the new outbuilding, which was a conversation that required walking the yard and looking at angles and considering drainage. She talked about her sheep for an hour, Lena said, about Clara Briggs. I don't know very much about sheep. Do you know more now? He said. A fair amount more, she said. Apparently there's a significant amount to know. She was measuring a line in the yard with her steps, counting off a distance from the cabin's south wall to the fence line, and she was doing it with the absorbed attention of someone who was genuinely solving a problem, not performing consideration of it. I think the structure should go here, she said, stopping. If it's set back from the fence line and oriented east-west, a south wind doesn't have the same angle at it. He walked over and stood where she was standing and looked at the angles. She was right. He'd been thinking about the same positioning and had arrived at approximately the same spot. He said, "You'll need the door facing east so you're not fighting the prevailing wind when you're working in there." "I know that," she said, in a way that wasn't impatient, just direct. "I know you know it," he said. "I said it out loud, so we're starting from the same place." She turned and looked at him. He'd been getting better over these months at reading the expressions she kept close. This one had something in it that was close to amusement. "You do that," she said. "Verify the shared premises before you proceed." "Does it bother you?" "No," she said. No." He looked at the yard for a moment, at the place where the outbuilding would go, and thought about how different this yard had looked in September when he'd ridden out for the first time with a half-formed idea and no clear plan. The fence line to the south had been listing, the water tank had been low, the woodpile had been insufficient. All of those things were different now, not because someone had come in and fixed them, but because the person who lived here had worked continuously at the problem of making them different, and because he had provided specific resources at specific moments that he'd hoped would amplify rather than replace her own effort. He was not sure he'd gotten the balance right every time. He thought about the moment Lena had told him he'd made the wrong call about not telling her what he was spending on the legal costs. She'd been right. He'd rationalized the withholding in terms of protecting her from obligation, but the honest examination of it showed that he'd also been afraid that knowing the scale of what he was spending would change what she thought about what he was doing and why, and he hadn't been ready to have that conversation directly. So he'd avoided it by controlling the information, which was exactly the kind of thing that people who wanted something from him did, and which he despised in them but had done himself when it was convenient. That was an uncomfortable thing to know about yourself. He'd sat with it for several weeks before he'd felt he'd actually absorbed it, rather than just acknowledged it. "There's something I want to say to you," he said. She turned, waiting. "What I've done this winter, the agreements, the cooperative, the legal work, I told myself it was strategic. Resource management, the right structure for the valley." He paused. "That's all true. But it's not complete." She didn't say anything. She'd learned, and he'd noticed her learning this, that he needed space to arrive at what he was saying rather than being helped toward it. "I rode out to your property in October because of a woman buying fence posts," he said. "That's where it started. Not with a plan. With something I didn't have a name for that made me want to know who you were." He looked at her. "Everything after that, the things I built, they were real on their own terms. But they were also built in the direction of you. I want you to know that, and I want you to know that I'm aware there's a version of it that could feel like being managed." She was quiet for a moment. The spring wind came across the yard and moved her hair, and she put it back where it had been with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had done that gesture 10,000 times. "Did it ever occur to you," she said finally, "that I know the difference?" "Between what?" "Between being managed and being seen." She looked at him with the directness that was the most specifically her quality he'd encountered in another person. "The night you told me Voss was going to come after me, you came to my porch and warned me before you had any strategic reason to, before it was useful to you. That's not management." She paused. "And the morning you showed up at the fire, you were there in 20 minutes. I didn't ask you. You just came." "You rode to get me," he said. "I rode to tell you," she said, "because you were the person I wanted to tell." "That's different." He looked at her. Something was happening in his chest that was not entirely comfortable and that he was not going to examine too closely in the middle of a yard on a Sunday afternoon. "Elias told me something last week," she said. "What?" "He said he'd watched a lot of men try to be useful to women in difficult positions, and most of them did it in a way that reminded the woman of the difficulty. He said you're one of the few men he's seen do it in a way that reminded a woman of her own capacity." She said it carefully, the way you repeat something you want to get right. "He doesn't give compliments easily." "I know that," Cade said. "He's made me earn every sentence." "He has," she agreed, and the thing that crossed her face was unmistakably amusement this time, fully formed. "He likes you, though. He won't say it, but he does." They stood in the yard for a while longer, talking about the outbuilding, the dimensions, the materials, whether they could salvage any of the hardware from the ruins of the old one, the question of labor and timeline. It was practical conversation, which was the mode they were both most comfortable in, and inside the practical conversation was everything else. The whole winter of accumulated honesty and difficulty, and two people who had been shaped by their different versions of the same lesson. That the people who wanted things from you were everywhere, and the people who simply showed up were rare, and had recognized that quality in each other in a market in September, and had spent 8 months building toward this yard, this Sunday, this conversation that was about an outbuilding and not about an outbuilding at all. The territorial court issued a preliminary ruling on Crew's complaint in June, which was faster than Crew had predicted and slower than Cade had hoped, which is how legal proceedings generally go. The ruling suspended Voss's ability to file new water rights claims in the valley pending the full hearing, which was the critical near-term protection. It also ordered a formal investigation into the Croftland acquisition, which put the land company and its ownership structure under official scrutiny. Voss hired 2 lawyers from the territorial capital and filed objections to 3 aspects of the cooperative's formation documents, which Crew had anticipated and prepared responses to. He also attempted to negotiate a settlement in which he would withdraw his water claims in exchange for a release of the property damage complaint, which Crew brought to Cade and which Cade brought to the cooperative's member ranchers, who voted against it unanimously and without significant deliberation. Hale, speaking for the group, said, "He burned down an old man's outbuilding. There's not a settlement number for that." Burl left the valley before the formal investigation reached him, which told its own story to anyone paying attention. The foreman stayed and hired a lawyer of his own, which suggested he intended to argue that he'd acted independently of Voss's knowledge, which was the defense Crew had predicted and had structured Eddie's testimony specifically to complicate. Cade did not spend his days watching the legal process. That was Crew's job, and Crew did it without needing supervision. Cade went back to running his ranch, which had been somewhat neglected through the winter's events, and required the attention of a man who intended to keep it in the condition he'd built it to. He also, on a series of Saturdays through May and into June, helped build an outbuilding. It went up on the spot Lena had measured off in April, east-west orientation, door facing east, set back from the fence line that gave it protection from a south wind. They used good timber, seasoned pine that Cade sourced through a supply contact in the county seat, and the hardware was new rather than salvaged because the salvage hadn't yielded enough that was worth reinstalling. Ott helped on the heavy framing days, and Rollo helped with the roofing, and Elias sat in his chair in the yard and offered structural opinions that were more often right than wrong and that everyone received with appropriate seriousness. There was a day in late May, a Saturday, when the framing was up and the roof was on, and they were working on the interior fittings, shelving, the partition wall for the feed storage. And Lena was fitting boards for the lower shelf with the focused competence she brought to physical work. And Cade was working on the opposite wall. And Elias was asleep in his chair in the yard because it was warm enough to sleep outside, and he'd taken the opportunity, and Ott and Rollo had gone back to the Mercer ranch for an afternoon repair job, and it was quiet except for the sound of their work and the wind and the distant noise of the creek, which was running well now, spring-fed and consistent. Lena said without stopping what she was doing, "The cooperative's first meeting is next Thursday." "I know," he said. "Hale's chairing it. He asked me if I wanted to be on the planning committee." He looked over at her. "What did you say?" I said yes. She set a board and checked its level. "I've been thinking about what the documentation process looked like from the inside for the smaller properties. There are things Crew's office didn't catch that the properties themselves would have caught if there'd been a better intake process. I want to build a better intake process." "For future members," he said. "For future members," she agreed, "and for the ones already in who may have gaps we haven't found yet." She paused. Is that overstepping? I'm the newest member, smallest property." He looked at her for a moment. She was genuinely asking. Under the competence and the directness was a person who had spent enough years on the margins of things, of Red Hollow's social structure, of the valley's economic life, of every room she'd walked into as the outsider who'd been looked past, that she still had moments of checking whether her presence in the center of something was legitimate. The intake process is the most important administrative function the cooperative has, he said. If someone doesn't build it properly, Voss's lawyers will find the gaps before we do and use them. The fact that your property is small doesn't have anything to do with whether you understand the problem. She held his gaze for a second. Then she went back to the shelf. All right, she said. You do that, he said. Do what? Check whether you're allowed to want something, he said. You've been doing it since September, the fence posts. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know I do it. I'm not criticizing it, he said. I'm noting it. Verifying the shared premise, she said. Yes. The premise being that I'm allowed to want things, she said. It was flat and a little dry and entirely self-aware. That's the premise, he said. She set another board, checked it. My grandfather said something similar to me once. When I was trying to decide whether to come to Red Hollow with him, I was 14 and I thought the right response to losing everything was to need as little as possible. She paused. He said wanting things isn't the problem. Wanting things from the wrong people is the problem. Cade worked on his wall for a moment. He's a smart man. He is, she said. He also told me this spring that you've been building toward asking me something and he wishes you'd do it already because the anticipation is becoming tiresome. Cade stopped working. He stood still for a second, and then he turned around, and she had turned from the shelf and was facing him with the expression she wore when she'd done something she was slightly entertained by and was waiting to see the result. He said that, Cade said. Close enough to that, she said. He set down what he was holding. He looked at her across the partially finished interior of the outbuilding that they'd built together on the land she'd been holding together alone for 4 years. He thought about September, about a woman who bought fence posts and argued the price down to 21 cents and didn't look for approval when she was done. He thought about a November evening on a porch and a January kitchen table with a lawyer's questions, and a February night when the sky behind her was the wrong color, and she'd come to find him because he was the person she wanted to tell. I want to ask you something, he said. I know, she said. I want to ask if you'd be willing to build something with me, he said. Not the outbuilding, not the cooperative. He paused. Something that lasts longer than either of those and is harder to construct and has no legal protection if it goes wrong. She looked at him. Outside, Elias was still asleep in his chair, or was pretending to be. The creek ran somewhere past the fence line. The wind moved through the new timber above them. That's an unusual way to ask, she said. You're an unusual person, he said. I thought the method should fit. She was quiet for a long moment. He had learned over these months to read the quality of her silences, and this one was not the silence of refusal or of discomfort. It was the silence of someone who was allowing themselves to want something and checking one final time whether they were certain. Yes, she said. He had expected, when this moment came, to feel something uncomplicated, relief or happiness in the clean sense. What he actually felt was more textured than that. It had gratitude in it and a kind of sobriety, the weight of understanding what yes meant coming from someone who said it carefully. It had something that was close to humility, which was not an emotion he spent much time with, but which seemed appropriate here. And underneath all of it was something he had no name for, which he thought might just be the feeling of the ground being solid when most of what you'd been standing on had been uncertain for a very long time. All right, he said. All right, she said. They went back to building the shelf. The full hearing on Crew's complaint was held in the autumn, and it ran for 4 days. And at the end of it, the territorial judge issued a ruling that was not everything Crew had hoped for and was substantially more than Voss's lawyers had offered to settle for. Voss was found liable for the property damage to the Ashford homestead, a finding that carried financial penalties and a formal censure. The conspiracy elements, the coordination of the infrastructure tampering, were upheld as to the foreman and Burrell, who were both assessed criminal charges. The connection to Voss personally was found partially proven, which meant he avoided the most serious exposure but carried the documented weight of the court's skepticism in language that was precise and not kind. His land company was ordered to divest the Croft acquisition at a price that the court determined rather than Voss, which meant he sold it at a loss to a coalition of buyers that included, among others, Denton Hale and the cooperative's new land fund, which Lena had helped design the intake documentation for, and which had been funded through member contributions that Cade had matched dollar for dollar without telling the other members he was doing so until Crew mentioned it incidentally in a meeting and then looked at Cade and said nothing further. Croft came back to the valley in the spring after the ruling. He didn't come back to farming. He'd sold his equipment and had no inclination to rebuild from scratch at his age. But he came back because the valley was where he'd lived for 16 years, and where his wife was buried, and where he still knew which direction was north without thinking about it. He bought a small house on the edge of Red Hollow's town limit, and helped Frank Purvis with seasonal labor, and seemed, by general observation, to be at peace with the shape his life had taken. He thanked Cade once, briefly, without excess. Cade said it wasn't necessary, which was true, and Croft said he'd spent enough time watching things be necessary and go unacknowledged that he'd decided to stop allowing that to happen, which Cade received and didn't argue with. The valley changed in the way that places change when a pressure that has been building for a long time is finally released. Not all at once, not completely, but in a settling that you could feel if you'd known the place before the pressure and knew it after. The cooperative's first full operating year ran without a significant dispute, which was not because disputes didn't arise, but because there was now a structure for resolving them that gave every member a voice proportional to their participation rather than their holdings. That structure was imperfect. It had inefficiencies and ambiguities and moments where the member meetings ran long and ended inconclusively and required additional meetings. That was what working structures looked like. That was how you knew they were real. Elias Ashford turned 70 in the summer after the ruling, and Lena made him a supper that he complained about in advance and ate entirely and complimented afterward by saying only that it was adequate, which from Elias was effusive. He walked with his cane and his hitch and his surveyor's eye, and he sat on his porch in the evenings and watched the valley and occasionally measured things that didn't need measuring and wrote the results in his ledger. He was not a man who required rescue or pity or to be treated as anything other than what he was, which was a person who had lived with discipline and attention and had ended up somewhere that had become, against all initial probability, home. Cade thought about that sometimes, about home as something that happens to you versus something you make. He had come to Red Hollow Valley at 19 with 9 horses and cracked axle and had made something here over 22 years through continuous, imperfect effort. He had not made it by wanting less than he wanted. He had made it by understanding which wants were worth building around. He thought about a thing Lena had said once, in passing, about her grandfather's advice, that wanting things wasn't the problem, that wanting from the wrong people was. He thought about how long it had taken him to find a person who wanted only the honest version of things and gave back the same. He thought about how easy it would have been to miss her, to see a woman at a market buying fence posts and register the category rather than the person and ride past and never know. There was a lesson in that, though he was wary of lessons that resolved too cleanly, because life in his experience did not resolve cleanly, and the lessons that claimed to were usually selling something. The honest version was more complicated, that you could do everything right, build carefully, protect yourself intelligently, manage your exposure to people's wanting, and still miss the thing that mattered because you were protecting yourself from it, and that the only way out of that problem was to stay awake to the specific texture of each person in front of you and resist the reflex to categorize before you'd looked. That was hard. It required a kind of sustained attention that was its own form of courage, which was not a word he used easily, but which seemed accurate here. He was sitting on his porch on an October evening, the anniversary, or close enough to it, of the September market when he'd first seen her and registered her as a person rather than a category, when Lena rode into his yard from the direction of her property. She did this sometimes now, in the evenings. Not often, not with explanation, just when the distance between their properties felt like something worth crossing. She tied her horse and came to the porch and sat on the step, which had become her preferred position. "Your reservoir's holding well," she said. "It is," he said. Ott said the inlet housing hasn't given any trouble since he redid the seal in March. "It hasn't." She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was the particular gold of October in the valley, warm and brief, the kind that made the dry grass look like it had value. "I've been thinking about the intake process for the cooperative," she said. There are two member properties that have boundary ambiguities that we haven't resolved formally. If Voss's lawyers decide to file something during the appeals period, Crew knows about both of them, Cade said. He's working the survey records. I know, She stopped. I think about the gaps. I know you do, he said. It's why the intake process is better than it was. She leaned back against the porch post, which was a relaxed position for her, more relaxed than she usually allowed herself in his presence or anyone else's. The months had changed that, not eliminated her natural guardedness, which was part of how she moved through the world and which suited her, but softened the defensive quality of it. She was guarded from habit now rather than necessity, and there was a difference. Your porch faces west, she said. Yes. You get the full sunset. That's why I built the house facing this direction, he said. She looked at the light. Ours faces east, she said. We get the morning. Between us, we've got the whole day covered, he said. She looked at him, and the thing on her face was full this time, unguarded, the expression of a woman who was in the right place at the right time with the right person and knew it, not in the romantic sense that made things simple, but in the earned sense that made them real. It was not a perfect face. It was tired in some places and careful in others, and entirely, specifically, hers. Yes, she said, we do. The sun went down over the ridge and the valley went blue, and the first cold of evening came off the mountains with its dry, honest bite, and the two of them sat with it, not filling the silence, not needing to. Some things you build piece by piece, in the cold, without knowing what they'll be until they're standing. Some things you look at, when they're done, and understand that they were worth every difficult, uncertain, imperfect day of the work it took to make them real. That understanding is not a small thing. In a life that doesn't offer many of them, it is in fact almost everything.